Great, thank you, Kirk. Thank you, Cam. I'm really sad to have missed yesterday's interesting session. If I look like I've just come from the beach, it's because I have just come from the beach. I was on holiday. I literally got on a plane and came here. But it's slightly sad to admit that I'm having pangs of what they call FOMO, fear of missing out, and I really feel like I actually missed out despite kind of luxuriating in the azure of the Aegean. I would have quite liked to be here listening to all these interesting talks, but enough of my problems. So I'm at the Grantham Research Institute, and one of the areas that I've worked with LSE Cities and others on is the question of cities. So the opportunity to make the obvious link, or to examine the obvious link between cities and wealth, was one that I really appreciated and welcomed. I mean, cities really do matter to the story of wealth. I mean, for one thing, just the sheer scale of the numbers make them important. Cities are currently home to half of the world's 7 billion population. By mid-century, that is expected to rise to between 2/3 and 3/4 of the world's population. We're adding about 60 million people a year to cities, and in particular, most of that tends to happen in emerging countries. That half of the world that isn't urbanized is mostly desperately poor. Most of the growth and most of the productivity tend to occur in urban centers. One of the really fascinating elements of this story is not just how quickly the world is urbanizing, but actually in historical terms how soon this story will be over. The urbanization transition and the demographic transition run hand in hand, such that by some point in the early to mid part of the next century, when the Earth's population is expected to stabilize at between 10 and 11 billion people, about 80 to 90% of the world is expected to be urbanized, and then that's about it. We will add possibly, we will go from a world of 3.5 billion people in cities at the moment to something close to 8 or 9 billion people by the early part of next century. And then in all the centuries that follow, we may add another billion. So really we're talking about all the action happening in the next 100 or so years. After that, this show is kind of more or less over. So as staggering as the urbanization increase in urbanization is, just as surprising to some extent as the dramatic slowdown in urbanization that is quite soon to follow. And this means that the urban form we lock in over the next few decades really will determine the productivity, resilience, and nature of the global economy for hundreds of years to come. The reason why the urbanization story in the terms of wealth is so important is, and this is what I hope to outline here and in my chapter, is that cities are replete with a lot of scale economies associated with agglomeration, network externalities, complementarities between people and capital and all forms of wealth. But they also have very long inertia and very long lock-in. So the wealth and the form of wealth you lock into will be around for decades, centuries, even millennia. And the example I use in London is there are many examples of the shape and form of London's economy based on decisions made by the Romans. Perhaps the most kind of amusing one being the Mind the Gap announcements you get on the tube, which are there because many of the tube lines were built around windy, somewhat kind of uncharacteristically for their reputation, the Romans built quite windy roads in London, and the tube stations, they didn't want to pay rent to private owners, so they followed the public roads, so the tube stations are bendy and they don't line up with the trains, and so you have these announcements to mind the gap. Next time you hear it, think of the Romans 2,000 years ago and the legacy that they had. But this mix of economies of scale and multiple equilibrium, path dependency, and lock-in is a very potent cocktail, because it says that if we get this next 100 years wrong, we will not only create and design, endogenously design, urban equilibria and urban wealth of a kind that we may or may not see as productive and sustainable, but then we'll be stuck with it, or it will be very expensive to replace and retrofit it. So the urbanization story is a hugely important one. Cities, of course, when it comes to wealth, contain a very large and, as I said, growing stock of wealth, and it's all forms of wealth. It's physical infrastructure, obviously rail, road, electricity, telecom, sanitation, productive capital, offices, factories, houses, and of course human capital and knowledge capital, skills, know-how, people, ideas, and so on. And these generate a productive stream of returns for cities, and it's this sort of heady cocktail of diversity and specialization that tends to make cities so productive. And of course, the growth in cities is testimony to the importance of clustering in generating wealth and the speed at which clustering generates wealth. Of course, cities but this concentration of wealth makes cities very vulnerable to all sorts of things like climate change, events such as water shortages, floods, heat island effects at night, also acts of war, terrorism, changes in resource prices, and concentrations of people breed their own negative externalities, obvious ones in the form of pollution, congestion, crime. We were talking yesterday about dense urbanization in poor countries with poor health, where you mix people and animals in great quantities as being a breeding ground, a laboratory for global pandemics. So there are a number of negative externalities that also need to be managed at the urban level. Well, it's clear that people cluster to be close to something, and that this clustering is very productive. But the question for policymakers is, why do people cluster, and what can policy do to try and ensure that that urbanization is of a kind that locks into a form of wealth that we think is most advantageous and minimizes some of those externalities that I've already spoken about. And there are indeed, the paper goes through clear findings that confirm that cities do generate both static and dynamic efficiency. Static efficiency is just, the efficiencies gained by people being close together and close to material resources, and dynamic efficiencies in terms of generating ideas that allow them to further improve the productivity with which those resources are used. And there are four leading sets of theories put forward to what generates agglomeration economies. The first, obviously, is access to goods and services. The second is access to people. The third is access to consumer benefit. And the fourth is access to ideas. Now, of course, they're not mutually exclusive and they're all interrelated, but the importance of these different drivers has changed through time. In particular, many cities were built on waterways with access to goods and services and resources. That's no longer seen as determining urban comparative advantage to the same extent that it did a couple of hundred years ago. It's now, the evidence suggests, more about face-to-face contact. As Glaser and Gottlieb put it, the important inputs are now management consultants, not iron ores, God help us. And fixed costs and economies of scale from manufacturing plants are no longer the main source of clustering. Indeed, more and more we see manufacturing moving to suburbs and non-urban areas, and it's business services that tend to locate in the center of cities. So the original triggers of urbanization may not be the same ones that drive urbanization today. The second, of course, is access to people, in particular being able to match workers. I'm going to rush through them in the interest of time. The third is consumer benefits. Of course, cities allow consumers to enjoy a diverse range of artistic events, which probably most of us take advantage of, artistic events, live performances, restaurants, and so on. These, of course, the difference here is it's important. These are not linked to productivity. You could be self-made and not be interested in wages or need to work ever again and still want to work in a city because you can enjoy a lot of these amenities. And it's one of the drivers of the phenomenon of reverse commuting, where people actually live outside cities, live inside cities, but then go and work outside cities. They prefer to consume in cities and work outside. But then the final and most important, at least in the current modern context, source of agglomeration and driver of agglomeration is access to ideas. Modern cities are far more dependent on the role that density can play in speeding the flow of ideas and exchange of ideas than the costs of moving good. And this was originally picked up by Alfred Marshall as far back as 1890, when he said that in dense clusters, the mystery of the trade become no mystery, but they are, as it were, in the air. And that's about people and ideas. Innovation spillovers are found to be very proximate in terms of location. Even things that you can measure, such as patent citation, very often occur in a geographically proximate region, let alone the intangible stuff that we don't readily observe and measure, such as exchange of ideas over the water cooler or in rooms like this. Admittedly, we are now in the middle of the countryside, but effectively we're a bunch of urbanites sharing ideas. So the concept, I think, still to some extent holds. And of course, that makes it unsurprising that a lot of the ideas in urban economics are also merging with the new growth economics, the kind that was spawned by Lucas and Roma and then picked up by Acemoglu, Agion and others, the whole endogenous growth story. Urbanization and spillovers of ideas in the urban context are part of that black box in the endogenous growth story that economists have tended not to focus on, perhaps to the extent that they deserve. So it's not surprising that a lot of the story about the endogenous generation of innovation and technology, and the complementarities between capital, human capital and physical capital, and the way they interact is becoming more important. We all know if you provide people with more computers, they'll come up with ever cleverer things to do with them. If you provide people with different forms of infrastructures like cycle lanes, they will cycle more, and then they will hold their politicians accountable for delivering more cycle lanes. These path dependencies that are born of induced behavior and innovation and complementarities across different forms of capital are one of the things that generate multiple equilibrium. Very different kinds of cities in different parts of the world because of these path dependencies. And a growing body of research, which I outline in the chapter, does support the hypothesis that cities effectively thrive because their ability to spread knowledge. This is a problem. Cities generate wealth, and wealth generates cities. So agglomeration breeds positive economies of scale. That induces inward migration, which induces agglomeration. And this endogeneity and reverse causality makes it very difficult to identify the proximate drivers of urbanization. And indeed, some of those drivers may no longer be relevant in the modern context. There's a great phrase from a lot of cities like New York and London. They located where they did because they had access to water and transport, but that's not the reason they are now continuing to grow. Krugman once said of Silicon Valley that God made Santa Clara for apricots, not semiconductors. And yet, once it's reached a critical mass, Santa Clara becomes the place to go in order to access both ideas, people, and so on in that particular field. There are examples in finance, London and New York, film in LA and Mumbai, Dhaka's garment industry, of clustering in order to be close to similar kinds of ideas and industries. This reverse causality means it makes it a bit of a headache to try and empirically identify key variables, which matters from a policy perspective. There are a number of studies I list in the paper which attend to instrument for these mutual causalities. It's very difficult to do, and ultimately getting to grips with what drives the agglomeration economies is incredibly difficult, but they're clearly there. And one piece of sort of anecdotal evidence that suggests that they're there is that you tend to get very little catch-up and diffusion just as quickly as areas of high productivity manage to transfer technologies and ideas to areas of low productivity. Those agglomeration effects are actually breeding cutting-edge ideas and innovation in those areas. So you get very little convergence across high productivity, low productivity areas and urban areas and rural areas. And that may also be one of the reasons that feeds into the broader literature about catch-up and convergence across the developed and developing world. The developed world is more urbanized and continues to push the technology frontier at a rate that's faster than ideas and technologies can be replicated and applied in other parts of the world. There's a big technology story here. If knowledge is what matters, then human capital and high technology are great complements, as I've said already. And there's a huge role for connectivity in improving the efficiency with which cities work. Cities are, in effect, the mass congregation of people. Cities, in effect, are networks which involve people. They're tight networks, so cities that think and adapt and evolve can learn to make better use of their resources, and network technologies have a great potential there for driving the efficiency of cities. In principle, that means that people who are skilled can increasingly live and work wherever they like, but what the evidence finds is that connectivity doesn't mean that traders move to the Swiss Alps and work from there. The reverse actually happens. Financial services and ICT are amongst the most connected sectors in the world, and yet they're also the ones that tend to cluster the most. That's why you get London, Hong Kong, and New York, and Tokyo, and you get Silicon Valley. It just testifies to the importance of face-to-face contact. And indeed, face-to-face contact and connectivity turn out to be complements rather than substitutes. The extra value you get from innuendo and gossip at the bar or a chat over the water cooler becomes even greater if everybody has the same access to information. So business services thrive off personal tips and personal relationships, and creative people will tend to want to eat, drink, and interact with other creative people, and that's one of the things that drives the success of urbanization. I've said already that the mass congregation of people generates all sorts of negative externalities, and they need to clearly be managed. And managing those puts enormous pressure on governance and policy. And this is the last section that the paper focuses on. It's really important, given what I've already said about the ability to generate multiple equilibria and then lock into them, that these pervasive, extensive network and scale economies are managed well. They suggest, the very presence of these kinds of economies suggests that the unfettered market will not produce the social optimum. And indeed, of course, there's clear evidence to suggest that policy to enhance urban wealth by investing in talent and skills, building networks of knowledge and connectivity, and also encouraging density are important in breeding successful cities. Density, of course, reduces the resource footprint of a city and does so quite substantially. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that building cities that are not based on sprawling suburbs and cars improve the resource efficiency by orders of magnitude, not just small percentage points, but orders of magnitude for cities of similar size and similar per capita GDP. There's quite an array of evidence there. So building cities right also has a good impact on natural capital. The ability of cities not to deplete natural capital is an important part of the wealth story. This endogeneity and reverse causality that I mentioned before makes it quite problematic to identify what the appropriate policies are, and Glaser and others, for example, point out that actually policies often make matters worse by attempting to sort of subsidize and support those areas that aren't growing as well, whereas in fact actually what you might want to do is politically much harder, which is support those cities that are actually dynamically successful, or indeed do nothing at all because the dynamics are self-propagating. So there's a big debate there. But clearly the lock-in story does suggest that the consequences of bad government or inaction over planning can have negative ramifications for decades or centuries. And so governance is massively important, and indeed innovation in governance may be as important as innovation in technologies. Evolving rules on how people govern themselves, how they interact with each other in an urban environment will determine the framework of incentives available for urban citizens to capture the gains from knowledge-led growth. And people are going to increasingly have to experiment and adopt new rules to structure the depth interaction of city lives, particularly in the rapidly urbanizing, developing world, such that new technologies are potentially very harmful if they're not accompanied by rules that make that growth sustainable. For example, rules on pollution, congestion, urban planning, soil degradation, and so on. Decentralization, devolved government, fiscal autonomy, these are also issues which are pertinent not just to the developing world, but to the developed world as well. And it's in the developing world where the greatest scope to lock in to the wrong kind of infrastructure resides. And it's in new cities also where some of the opportunities to leapfrog the outmoded infrastructures of the developed world are highest. So, there's a lot of opportunity here over the next 100 years for experimentation with new solutions, learning from best practice and so on, and learning what problems might hold back growth, and which issues are due to the insufficient capacity of local government, because it's governance that's the biggest threat to sustainable urbanization. I'm getting that look from Kirk, which suggests that my time is probably up. But to summarize everything I've said in less than a minute, there's a clear and strong connection between urbanization and wealth creation across the spectrum of wealth assets. There is a mutually reinforcing agglomeration economy from urbanization that suggests that unmanaged development of urban economies can potentially be very damaging, but it also suggests it's important that you think carefully about how policy plays into a process that is otherwise self-generating and self-driving. And the drivers of innovation and urbanisation consequently deserve, I think, more attention than policymakers, academic and indeed business entrepreneurs worldwide are giving them, because if we get the urbanisation story wrong, we will get the climate and resource story wrong, and we'll get the growth and productivity and innovation story, if not wrong, certainly in a form that's much less dynamically successful in generating welfare and the accumulation of wealth than if we get it right. Thank you.
That probably takes the highest marks for density, I think, of information. Wonderful, thank you. And density also meant that we're pretty much on time at this point. Christian.
Well, I will do a very quick comment on the chapter, and I will do this comment just with 3 questions to Dimitri that I am trying to do a better link between this chapter and the concept of wealth that we are discussing here. Well, my first question, and also is a small critic, is which is the definition of the city that you use in the chapter? Because I'm pretty sure that the density, the area, and the population are different for any country. So I guess that the definition of city that you are using in this chapter is like a global definition of city, but you have to mention, at least in the introduction of the chapter. And this is a question that I want to have some answer now, and especially for the regional dimension of the city. So I live in a country with a low density, so a city with 100,000 inhabitants, maybe it's a village in China. So I want to know more about this. Also about the attraction and creation of wealth, how do you think about the housing prices and the housing prices and the ratio with income? So do you think that it could be like a threat to the wealth creation? Because in some cities, as London, as the biggest sample, the increasing housing prices is not an incentive, it's a correction to move to London for a lot of people that maybe they want to be in a city like London. Finally, and this is maybe a more tricky question, it's about infrastructure, because you mentioned the necessity of infrastructure for the cities, like especially in the planning of the cities. But when you are talking a bit about infrastructure, you are thinking more in a market, a normal market value, or in the capital service? Because taking as example the discussion that we had yesterday, some infrastructure is really expensive, of course, for the cities, but the service in the long run are really important for the growth of these cities. So I don't know if you have some ideas in the value, in how to measure the value market with the capital service that you get from this infrastructure. And well, it's a really nice paper. It's really fast, really easy to read. But I think that the only problem that has this paper is that I don't see a strong link between the wealth debate and the chapter. But I think that is something that you can work, especially in the introduction. So, like doing some definitions about city and wealth, and especially the measure of this wealth in the long run. So, thank you.
We have the luxury of a couple of minutes for questions, so I would invite them, and then a minute for for Dimitri to wrap up. So please, Mariana.
So you sort of mentioned this, but I was wondering if you can reflect on it a bit more. So most, I mean, at least in the innovation world, most regional policies actually have failed. And they failed for the reason that you say, that sometimes these regional effects just happen for other reasons. You know, the classic example is the one that Paul Krugman mentioned around carpets. That something like 75% of tufted carpets are made in some random place in Georgia, Dalton, Georgia, but because, you know, these girls, when they were 18 years old in the 1800s, learned how to do tufted bedspreads, started to give it to each other for birthday parties, and then the tufted carpet industry ended up, you know, going there because there was that local labor pool, blah, 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 and then one thing leads to another, dynamic returns to scale. So if you can just say something a bit more on, you kind of said, okay, let's just let this happen, but then you also said for the successful cities or areas, coming back to the point that the commentator just made, that maybe this isn't about cities, but places, regardless of whether it's city, a mountain, hut, or whatever, where interesting things happen, then to support post facto those areas. So again, the post facto kind of dynamics from dynamic returns to scale versus something that you can almost predict beforehand. If you can elaborate on that a bit more.
Please, Rolando.
I think I don't know whether you have read it. I've not read the paper, so I don't know. But one issue that may be interesting is that there may be a link of wealth to the city through the rise in property prices, which indeed, as a manifestation of inequality perhaps, is causing a number of people who are needed in the city to have to live outside the city, and the cost this has for the well-being and let's say the social welfare in the city.
Okay, you have the luxury of a bit of time to respond.
They're all excellent questions. All right, let me sort of take them in turn. There's no, you know, there's no threshold at which a certain density becomes considered urban. There are huge problems with measuring cities. They're usually measured in accordance with administrative areas rather than functional areas. And there are many different definitions. I use the United Nations definition, but you're absolutely right, there needs to be some explanation about different definitions of what is a city, what is urban.
Well, especially when you talk a lot about Barcelona.
Yeah.
I was living in Barcelona 8 years, and the city is like the example of the well management of the city. And they talk about Barcelona like it's 1.5 million people, but the metropolitan area of Barcelona are 4.5 million.
Exactly.
And the people of the metropolitan area, they have a lot of problems to write to the city. So
that's exactly.
Where is the well-being of the
and this is an age-old problem, as I say. That's the sort of administrative area versus functional area. What we care about is the functional area. What you tend to get data on is the administrative area, and the two don't overlap very well. So there's all sorts of measurement and definition problems. And I think you're right, there needs to be some explanation of that a little more clearly. Even if there isn't, it's an imponderable and an insoluble problem to some extent. I think it certainly needs greater discussion. Now, you've both talked about houses. I had a chat, so this chapter is sort of 8,000 words long. At one point it was kind of 10,000 plus. I had a whole chapter on housing, and in the end, I just took it out to save space. I also had I had a section on the impact on the balance of payments as well, which I took out. I think the housing one I probably won't get away with taking it out. It's so central to the endogenous dynamics. Important questions about the degree to which housing is net wealth rather than intergenerational or regional transfers, and the role in of policy and planning in alleviating scarcity and responding to the endogenous drivers in the form of demand by what's the appropriate threshold of creation of supply to maximise the dynamic returns of urbanisation. Those are actually key questions. In fact, they're so important that I decided in the end that I either go into it in some detail or I just take it out.
There is a red light flashing at you.
Right, okay, so the comment suggests I should probably say something. Infrastructure, the net returns to infrastructure is a massive, I always think in London, every time in my lifetime that a new tube line or a new underground line is built, there is a cost-benefit analysis that is undertaken to show how it is not worth the money spent on it. I mean, literally every single time, and I'm told that also applies historically before I was around. Now, if we followed each and every one of those cost-benefit analyses, we'd have no underground system in London, and London would look more like Jakarta. So clearly the social benefits and the full spillovers and the dynamic returns to these infrastructure projects aren't fully taken account of, at least not in the sort of formal construct in many instances, and it's very difficult to do that. But the net collective network effect of some of these infrastructure investments at the urban level, I've yet to sort of, maybe somebody can tell me in the city, but they've over-invested in some of these things, at least not a city of a genuine proper size. I know that Detroit has its sort of skyway and things, and there are examples. But I think that question of valuing the social spillover.
And I think it's time for me to thank you.
Okay, well, it was just Mariana's.
Briefly.
Mariana's point on, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's, if you've got these dynamic path dependencies, then what that tells you is that intervention can have, and design and planning can have substantial effects, but they can be good as well as bad. And if you don't understand the key drivers or if they're misplaced, if you like, it adds extra leverage to the importance of policy, both right and wrong. And I think there are many examples where trying to change a system that has its own self-propagating dynamics and intervening in a way that tries to alter those dynamics can be counterproductive. And I think that's a point well taken.
Thank you very much.